You wake to the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through cold stone corridors, each step growing louder, more urgent. Your small fingers clutch at the coarse wool blanket, heavy with the scent of mildew and something deeper, neglect. Through a narrow slit of a window, the first pale light of day rises over Vienna, 1793 AD. But no warmth reaches this forgotten tower chamber of the Habsburg Palace. You are 7 years old, though no one has ever told you. In truth, no one has told you anything at all, because no one speaks to the child kept hidden from view. Your name, if anyone still remembered it, was Ferdinand, born into the family of Emperor Leopold II. But here, names hold no value in this silent tomb for the living, where noble blood means nothing if the mind behind it works in ways others do not understand. Your attendant enters. Not a nurse, not a governess, just a woman paid to ensure you are fed and kept out of sight. She avoids your gaze, avoiding those almond-shaped eyes that mark you as different, as flawed, as something that should never have appeared in a bloodline claiming divine appointment. She places a bowl of porridge, already cold, on the table and leaves without a word. No words. Never any words. Outside, your cousins study Latin and philosophy, practice the graceful steps of court dances, and rehearse the art of diplomacy. Inside, you watch motes of dust drift in the lone shaft of light for hours because it's all you have. Before we dive into these hidden stories of survival and quiet suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten truths of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I'm always amazed that we can explore these lost histories together, across centuries and continents, bound by our shared curiosity for the past. In the grand palaces of Europe, behind gilded doors and beneath painted ceilings, meant to depict heavenly glory, lived children whose very existence threatened the foundations of what their families believed about divine right and pure blood. These were sons and daughters born with what we now know as Down syndrome, a genetic condition caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, leading to distinctive facial traits, intellectual disabilities, and often heart problems. But in the centuries before Dr. John Langdon, Down described the condition in 1866 AD. Before anyone understood chromosomes or genetics, such children were viewed as curses, family shames, or divine punishments for hidden sins. For royal dynasties, whose entire claim to power rested on the idea of superior breeding and God's chosen favour, the birth of such a child was a political disaster. While a peasant family might accept their child as God's will and give them small tasks on the farm where they could still contribute, royal families demanded flawlessness. Every prince and princess existed as political currency. Future alliances, marriage contracts, and living emblems of dynastic strength. A child who could not master court etiquette, who might drool during a banquet, or who could never navigate the complex rituals of diplomacy, threatened not only family pride, but the very stability of the realm. Consider the case of Prince John of the United Kingdom, youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. Born in 1905 AD at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, his early years appeared typical of a royal child, photographed alongside siblings in sailor suits, presented to important visitors. But around age 4, seizures began. Alongside epilepsy, doctors noted signs of learning difficulties and physical features now associated with Down syndrome, though no official acknowledgement was ever made. By 1909 AD, John vanished from public life. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, recorded in her diary visits to poor little Johnny at Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate, where he lived under the care of his devoted nurse, Charlotte Lala, Bill. Alexandra described a boy lost in his own world, delighted by small pleasures, collecting acorns, watching gardeners at work, and laughing at games only he understood. His siblings were discouraged from visiting. His parents kept their distance, seeing him more as a duty than as a son. When John died in 1919 AD at age 13 after a severe seizure, Queen Mary wrote to a friend that his death was a release for the child and perhaps the greatest mercy for the poor little soul. Words like release and mercy echo throughout royal letters about such children, revealing a worldview where difference meant suffering and where inability to fulfill a dynastic role meant a life was barely worth living. Yet between the lines, humanity sometimes breaks through. Lala Bill kept every drawing John made, every photograph, every trinket he treasured. After his death, she was quietly given a pension, carrying with her memories of a boy who loved music and animals, a far cry from the official tale of tragedy and relief. Travel further back to France, 1640 AD, where whispers spread through the palace of Fontainebleau about a child born to King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria, a child who appeared before the future Sun King Louis XIV. Official court records mention only a frail infant who failed to thrive. But private letters between royal physicians, uncovered centuries later in the Vatican's secret archives, described features we now recognize: a flat nasal bridge, a single palmar crease, a protruding tongue. This unnamed prince lived just 43 days. His wet nurse, interrogated repeatedly, swore she had fed him well and done nothing wrong. And indeed, she hadn't. The baby likely suffered from the heart defects that affect nearly half of all children with Down syndrome. But in an age where infant death demanded blame and royal blood was thought to be stronger than common stock, someone had to be found guilty. Palace gossip claimed Queen Anne commissioned special prayers and went on pilgrimages, seeking divine explanation for why God had marked her child. Some whispered it was punishment for the king's sins, others blamed the queen's Spanish heritage. Still others pointed to omens in the stars at the moment of conception. What no one said, what no one dared to, was the simple truth that sometimes nature varies and such a child is neither curse nor punishment, but simply different. Such a way of thinking would not take root for centuries. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty carried its own hidden sorrows. While history recalls Tsarevich Alexei's haemophilia, few know of Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich's youngest daughter, born in 1882 AD. Her name never appears in official genealogies. Only a vague note of infant daughter died young, if mentioned at all. Yet payroll records from Alexander Palace show ongoing payments to a small group of servants assigned to the East Wing nursery for 16 years after her birth, far longer than the care of a deceased infant would require. Letters from ladies-in-waiting describe a girl who never mastered speech, who at 14 still clutched dolls meant for toddlers, who had to be watched constantly lest she wander barefoot into the frozen gardens in her nightgown, laughing at falling snow. When the revolution erupted in 1917 AD, she simply disappeared from the historical record. Did soldiers find her in that secluded nursery, bewildered by the shouting and gunfire? Did a loyal servant whisk her away to some remote village where a gentle-minded woman who loved dolls could live unnoticed? Or did her fleeing family decide, with cold calculation, who could and could not be saved? We will never know. Revolutions have a way of erasing both inconvenient truths and the regimes that once hid them. In Spain, the Habsburg line, already infamous for its inbreeding, produced many children with disabilities. Charles II, known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, is well remembered. His Habsburg jaw so deformed he could barely chew, his speech delayed until age 4, his mental faculties stunted. But Charles had siblings and cousins who never made it into the official portraits, who were denied names and titles entirely. Spanish court physicians left coded Latin notes, never meant for public eyes, describing infants with Mongol features. They observed how such births grew more frequent, with each generation of cousin marriages and uncle-niece unions, desperate attempts to preserve royal bloodlines. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, writing in 1693 AD, detailed his examination of a princess whose name had been deliberately erased from the records. He noted her small stature, difficulty swallowing, and severe developmental delays, but also her boundless affection, her eagerness to embrace everyone she met, her sheer delight in music and dancing, even when she couldn't keep rhythm. Zapata's willingness to suggest that perhaps these children were not cursed, but were simply part of God's mysterious creation would cost him dearly. He was eventually burned by the Inquisition. His notes, hidden in the false bottom of a medical volume, remained undiscovered until 1954 AD. The Ottoman Empire had its own rules, but its stories were just as tragic. Sultan Mehmed III, who reigned from 1595 to 1603 AD, was said to have had a son with distinctive features and developmental delays. In the Ottoman system, succession was ruthless. Princes were expected to fight for the throne, and any sign of weakness could mean death. This unnamed prince did not die in infancy, as the records claim. Instead, he was confined to the cafes, the cage, a gilded prison within Topkapi Palace where potential heirs were kept in isolation. Palace records show that food and supplies were delivered to a specific room in the cafes for 23 years after this prince's supposed death. Guards recalled hearing strange sounds from within, not the plotting or complaints of other captive princes, but repeated singing of the same melodies and bursts of laughter at odd hours. When Sultan Ahmed died in 1617 AD and the palace descended into succession chaos, every room in the cafes was opened to account for possible heirs. One guard's memoir, written decades later, describes finding an adult man with the mind of a child seated among thousands of coloured glass fragments laid out in intricate patterns on the floor. He had spent 2 decades creating art no one would see, humming songs no one would hear, living a life no one would acknowledge. What became of him after that day is unknown. The records go silent. Another ghost lost within palace walls. The Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria left more traces of their hidden children, perhaps because King Ludwig I's eccentricities made such oddities almost fashionable. His cousin, Princess Alexandra, born in 1826 AD, was confined to the so-called quiet wing of Nymphenburg Palace. Official biographies claim she died at the age of 3, yet household accounts list expenses for her upkeep until 1851 AD. A governess's diary, donated to the Bavarian State Library in 1923 AD, described teaching a 25-year-old woman basic tasks, dressing herself, using a spoon, recognizing letters, though she would never form words. The governess wrote tenderly of Alexandra's love for her pet canaries, how she could sit for hours listening to them sing, perfectly content in a world that asked nothing more from her. Yet even this gentleness had its limits. Alexandra could live, but unseen. She could exist, but not as a princess, not as a name recorded in the line of succession. When she died, her body was quietly placed in an unmarked corner of the royal crypt, without ceremony, without mention, as if 25 years could be erased by pretending they had never existed. In Portugal, the Braganza dynasty faced a similar dilemma in 1734 AD, when Infanta Maria Francisca was born to King John V. As was custom, court painters were summoned to create her official portrait, yet the work was never completed. The artist, John Rank, abruptly left Portugal with his commission unpaid and his sketches destroyed. Years later, on his deathbed in Madrid, Rank reportedly confessed to a priest about the infant princess whose likeness he could not render to the king's satisfaction. "How do you paint innocence itself," he asked, "when innocence is not what power demands?" Maria Francisca lived until the age of 11, hidden away in the convent of Santos o Novo in Lisbon. The nuns who cared for her described a child eager to help, folding altar cloths, feeding the convent's animals, singing along to prayers even though she never learned the words. When fever claimed her life in 1745 AD, the nuns requested that she be buried in their cemetery rather than have her remains returned to the royal family. Permission was granted at once, almost with enthusiasm. Her tombstone bears only the words, "Child of God." No name, no dates, no mention of the crown she could never claim. Meanwhile, Denmark's royal family took a different approach with Prince Gustav, born in 1803 to Frederick VI. Instead of hiding him entirely, they constructed an elaborate story. They claimed Gustav suffered from a nervous ailment requiring constant travel for his health. In truth, he was quietly relocated between far-off royal estates every few months, never staying long enough for locals to notice his differences. His tutors, more accurately, caretakers, submitted false reports of his academic progress, while in reality teaching him basic life skills. Letters preserved in the Danish royal archives reveal their struggle to keep up the ruse while forming genuine affection for him. One tutor, Hans Eriksson, described Gustav's remarkable memory for faces, his ability to predict weather changes days in advance, and his uncanny sense for knowing when someone was lying. Eriksson reflected, Perhaps we define intelligence too narrowly. The prince grasps things I cannot, sees patterns invisible to me. So who truly has the deficit, him or us? But such progressive thinking found no support in the Danish court. When Gustav died at 31, officially of pneumonia, but likely from a heart condition associated with Down syndrome, his death was announced as happening in Italy during a treatment trip. His body was returned to Denmark in the dead of night and buried before sunrise. His entire life reduced to a single line in the royal record. Sweden's Bernadotte dynasty, still new to monarchy, might have been expected to treat such differences with greater compassion. Yet when Prince Carlos was born in 1852 with clear developmental disabilities, they repeated the same pattern as older dynasties. Official records claimed he died at 3 months old. Unofficial records, testimonies from servants, doctors' bills, and food orders suggest he lived until at least age 9 at Tullgren Palace, 30 miles from Stockholm. A groundskeeper's son, in his memoirs decades later, remembered playing with a peculiar boy in the palace gardens, a boy who could not speak but laughed constantly, feared nothing, and could spend hours staring at ant colonies. This boy appeared only when the royal family was away and disappeared just before their return. He was like a ghost, the memoir reads, but the happiest ghost you could imagine. In Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg tradition of inbreeding produced many children with disabilities. Emperor Franz Joseph's brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, had a son in 1868 who was immediately declared stillborn, but a midwife's diary discovered during WR tells another story. The baby lived, she wrote, but with features that made the emperor recoil. Hours after his birth, he was taken from his mother, who was told he had died. The midwife was sworn to secrecy, paid generously, and warned that breaking her oath could mean death. Years later, she was summoned to a monastery outside Vienna to care for a sick boy and instantly recognized him. The monks, she learned, had been paid to raise him as an orphan, unaware of his royal blood. They named him Felix, meaning happy, because, despite his limitations, he radiated joy. He spent 12 years among them, helping with small chores, loved deeply by the brothers who saw in him a kind of holiness. When scarlet fever claimed him in 1880, the entire monastery mourned. The abbot's record reads, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him more than the world ever could." Such hidden children existed in nearly every European royal household. Their stories followed the same tragic outline: birth, recognition of difference, concealment, erasure. Yet sometimes, cracks in the official story revealed unexpected compassion. Prussia's Prince Waldemar, born in 1889 to Wilhelm II's sister, was concealed like the others. But his nurse, Emma Muller, spent her wages commissioning an artist to paint his portrait every year on his birthday, 17 portraits in all, capturing his growth with dignity and care. After his death in 1906, Emma tried to give the portraits to his mother, but they were refused and burned before her eyes. The last trace of Waldemar's existence turned to ash. Emma spent the rest of her life writing to newspapers about him, but none would publish her words. Those letters, found after her death, describe a young man who adored trains, could identify every bird by its song, and could memorize full orchestral works after a single hearing. He was not less than, she wrote. He was different than, and different, in God's eyes, is not wrong. In Italy, the House of Savoy had its own secret. When Princess Giovanna was born in 1879, they chose a middle path. She appeared at select, tightly managed public events, always from a distance, and never for long. The public was told she was delicate and couldn't endure lengthy ceremonies. In reality, she was carefully rehearsed for weeks beforehand, taught to wave, smile, and stand still for precisely timed moments before being taken away. Behind palace doors, Giovanna enjoyed more freedoms than many in her position. Her tutors built on her strengths: her excellent musical memory, her learning through repetition, her gentle rapport with animals. Her household staff spoke to her as a person, not a problem. When she died at 33, her funeral was private but dignified. King Alberto I, her uncle, reportedly said, "She lived as God made her, and that was enough." But Italy's relative humanity was rare. In Belgium, King Leopold II, infamous for his atrocities in the Congo, showed no greater kindness to his own daughter, born in 1864 with disabilities. In her memoirs, Princess Stephanie later mentioned a sister never spoken of, whose room in the palace was eventually walled up entirely. Servants from the era, interviewed in the 1920s, recalled hearing a child's voice from behind those walls for years, singing nonsense songs, calling for a mother who never came. One servant, Marie Delacroix, risked her livelihood to pass food and small toys through a narrow gap in the walled-off section. She later testified that the child whose name she never learned would push back drawings through the same opening. These were simple yet vivid pictures of people with enormous smiles, sons with faces, and what appeared to be attempts at writing Mama. Marie kept one drawing, which she showed the historian interviewing her. A sheet of paper covered in handprints made with what seemed to be berry juice, each print surrounded by carefully drawn hearts. Romania's monarchy, established only in 1866 AD, quickly absorbed the unspoken rules of royal shame. When Crown Prince Carol's son was born in 1893 AD with visible disabilities, the infant was declared dead within hours. But Queen Elizabeth, a poet and mystic who wrote under the name Carmen Silva, refused to accept this erasure. In her private journals, she wrote at length about the angel child who had been called back to heaven, too pure for this earth. These entries, clearly written in code, reference visiting his star each night, likely a symbolic way of noting wherever he was truly kept. Records from a Romanian Orthodox monastery during this period show a mysterious benefactor donating large sums for the care of a special child of God. These donations came with exact instructions. The boy was to be taught music, given art supplies, never hit or restrained, and always spoken to kindly. The donations continued for 7 years before suddenly stopping. That same year, the monastery's chronicle recorded that their special charge had died of a fever, passing gently as he had lived. Even in the 20th century, as medical understanding of Down syndrome advanced, royal families persisted in their habits of concealment. Greece's royals, often in exile and later restored, left scattered references to children who lived in the margins of history. A physician who treated them in exile in the 1920s wrote in his memoirs about a teenage princess whose very existence was unofficial. Born with Down syndrome, she had been hidden from birth, with her parents told she had died. In truth, a loyal servant had taken her away and raised her secretly, only seeking medical help when pneumonia set in. The doctor treated her successfully, but was appalled at the family's reaction. Rather than joy at learning their daughter lived, they offered him a fortune to resolve the problem. He refused, fled the country, and spent decades wondering what became of the girl who had clutched his hand and repeated, "Nice man," over and over, the only word she knew. In the Netherlands, whispers endured for generations about Queen Wilhelmina's lost child. Official records list only one daughter, Juliana, but palace staff from the 1890s told a different story of a second pregnancy, a birth without any announcement, and a child who stayed briefly in the palace before disappearing. Years later, a farming family in Friesland told of their touched daughter, an infant left with them by anonymous benefactors who paid for her care but never visited. The girl, who lived until 1934 AD, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Dutch royal line, though no one dared say it aloud. Norway's monarchy, independent only since 1905 AD, faced its own test in 1912 AD when Princess Ragnhild was born to the future King Olav V. Officially, she lived only 3 days. Unofficially, she spent 8 years in a special medical facility in Switzerland, visited monthly by a veiled Norwegian noblewoman. The facility's files, seized by the Nazis in 1940 and later recovered by the Allies, describe a child with mongoloid features who was affectionate toward everyone and delighted in simple joys. Her death in 1920 AD was attributed to the influenza pandemic, though she most likely succumbed to heart complications common to her condition. These accounts, spanning centuries and dynasties, reveal a pattern with grim consistency: shame, fear, concealment, erasure. Royal blood that was somehow deemed not royal enough. A divine right to rule, undermined by natural human variation. And yet, the very traits that make individuals with Down syndrome extraordinarily warm, joyful, and free from the pretensions that burden typical people traits, entirely at odds with rigid royal hierarchies, shone through in the margins. Between the lines of destroyed records and official denials, glimpses of compassion appear: servants who risked all to show kindness, nurses who saved photos and drawings, monks and nuns who recognized holiness where others saw only shame. Even some royal parents, bound by the pressures of their position, found ways to ensure their hidden children experienced some measure of comfort and care. Consider Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915 AD to Crown Prince Wilhelm. Unlike earlier generations, her parents did not declare her dead. Instead, she was placed in a specialized institution where education was tailored to her strengths. She learned to read simple books, write her name, and play the piano, not well, but with boundless enthusiasm. When the Nazis rose to power and began euthanasia programs targeting the disabled, her family faced an impossible choice. Records suggest she was quietly moved to Switzerland, living under an assumed identity until her death in 1980 AD, outliving the empire she might have been born to serve. World War II marked a shift, though not always a positive one. The Nazis' systematic killing of disabled individuals, including those with Down syndrome, horrified even royal families who had long hidden such children. Some recognized their own role in fostering the prejudices that enabled such atrocities. Others simply refined their secrecy, reasoning that in a world where the state could murder these children, private concealment was the lesser evil. After the war, as Europe modernized, royal attitudes began a slow transformation. When Prince Jean of Luxembourg was born in 1957 AD with Down syndrome, his family made a groundbreaking choice. They acknowledged him, not with pride, but with honesty, admitting that he lived in a specialized care facility and that he was their son and brother. This was a small crack in centuries of absolute denial. By the 1960s and 1970s, medical advances meant that children with Down syndrome were living longer, healthier lives. Royal families could no longer plausibly insist such children inevitably died in infancy. Some began quietly lending support to charities that assisted families raising children with disabilities, though they rarely admitted why the cause was personal. Others maintained the old practices, simply updated with modern precision: secluded facilities in remote areas, trust funds designed to secure silence, and medical files disappearing into private archives. Spain's contemporary royal family broke sharply with precedent in 1973, when they openly acknowledged that King Juan Carlos's nephew had been born with Down syndrome. He appeared in family photos, joined certain public events, and was spoken of warmly rather than hidden in shame. It was groundbreaking, and it underscored just how recently even the simplest public acknowledgement had been denied to such children. Today, we understand that Down syndrome is simply a genetic variation, occurring in roughly 1 out of every 700 births across all cultures, classes, and bloodlines. We know that people with Down syndrome can live full and meaningful lives, that they feel the same range of emotions as anyone else, and that intellectual disability does not diminish their humanity. We know this now. But for centuries, royal dynasties that claimed divine selection and justified their authority through supposed genetic superiority simply could not allow themselves to know it. Modern royals still face these realities, though often with more compassion than those before them. When whispers emerge about a royal child with disabilities, palace spokespeople issue carefully worded statements about privacy and family. Support is arranged, care is provided, yet full inclusion in royal duties remains uncommon. Old habits are stubborn, and the demand for royal perfection, or at least the appearance of it, still lingers. Some historians argue that these hidden children represent one of monarchy's deepest moral failings: the systematic denial of dignity to their most vulnerable members. Others note that royal families acted in line with the prevailing medical and social beliefs of their eras, which labelled such children as mongoloid idiots and recommended institutionalization. Both views carry truth. Royals didn't invent society's prejudices toward disability, but their influence meant they bore a special responsibility for reinforcing them. In exploring these histories, one encounters an archive defined by absence. Erased names, destroyed documents, painted over portraits, graves left unmarked or secretly relocated. For every known case, how many others vanished without a trace? How many royal children with Down syndrome spent their lives known only to a few sworn servants? How many died believing themselves orphans, unaware that their parents, perhaps in the very same palace, continued producing heirs deemed more acceptable? Perhaps the saddest part is not the secrecy itself, but what it cost all involved. Parents who might have loved their children instead learned to see them as a source of disgrace. Siblings who might have grown up with empathy instead absorbed a belief in their own genetic superiority. The children themselves, who might have thrived with acceptance and proper support, were left to live diminished lives, hidden from the world. Today's medical advances bring new choices. Prenatal testing can identify Down syndrome before birth, creating a different but equally complicated moral question. Some royal families have likely chosen termination after such a diagnosis, adding a new layer to this legacy of absence. Others have chosen to continue pregnancies and raise their children, though usually away from public attention. The last confirmed instance of a European royal child with Down syndrome being kept entirely from the public eye was in the 1960s, though rumours suggest more recent examples handled with extreme discretion. Modern privacy laws and ethical medical standards make such cases difficult to confirm, and perhaps that's as it should be. These children deserve privacy, but not erasure. They deserve protection, but not captivity. Imagine if history had been different. If Prince John had stood beside Edward VIII during the abdication crisis. If the Spanish Habsburgs had admitted that their pure bloodline produced as much human variation as any commoners. If, somewhere in those centuries of denial, one royal family had declared, "This is our child, different but cherished, and we will not hide them." We cannot undo history, restore erased names, or find all the lost graves, but we can acknowledge that these forgotten princes and princesses existed, that they mattered, that their lives had value beyond the thrones they would never inherit or the alliances they could never secure. They were children who laughed and cried, who felt love and loneliness, and who saw the world in ways their so-called normal siblings never could. Some, despite everything, still found moments of happiness. Like the unnamed Russian Grand Duchess arranging her glass treasures, Prince Gustav predicting the weather, or Felix bringing joy to his monastery. Others likely endured lives of deep isolation and neglect, sensing only that they were somehow wrong, somehow disgraceful, somehow less than human in the eyes of those who should have cared for them. Their stories compel us to face uncomfortable truths about how society treats difference, how systems of power uphold narrow standards of worth, and how shame can be handed down through generations like a cruel inheritance. In their treatment of children with disabilities, royal families reflected back society's darkest instincts, the urge to erase difference, conceal imperfection, and pretend that human variation is an abnormality rather than nature's constant. Today's royals exist in a changed world, one shaped by disability rights movements, where inclusion is valued in principle, if not always fully in practice. Yet the ghosts of those hidden children still linger, wandering palace halls and lying in unmarked graves, reminding us that privilege and power do not guarantee compassion. Blue blood can run just as cold as any other. Picture once more the child in the Habsburg Tower, watching dust drift through the morning light. Their name might have been Ferdinand, Franz, Maria, or one of dozens of names we'll never know. They lived and died under a shame that was never theirs to bear, victims of a worldview incapable of accepting difference, blind to the beauty of variation, unable to see that the true shortcoming was not in their extra chromosome, but in their family's lack of compassion. Their attendant departs, footsteps fading along the stone hallways, and the child returns to tracing the dance of light and shadow across ancient walls, unaware that hundreds of others across Europe share the same fate. Royal blood that wasn't royal enough. A so-called divine right undermined by human reality. They hum a tune no one else will hear, arrange objects into patterns that make sense only to them, and wait for tomorrow's bowl of cold porridge, tomorrow's silent attendant, tomorrow's brief moment of filtered sunlight in a room the world pretends does not exist. In the end, these forgotten royals tell us less about Down syndrome than they do about power itself, how it corrupts not only through ambition, but through fear, not only through cruelty, but through shame. They remind us that every society casts its shadows, hides its unmentionables, and erases its unwanted. The true measure of civilization is not in palaces or crown jewels, but in how it treats those who don't conform, who can't play the game, who live beyond the borders of what is deemed acceptable difference. Somewhere in Europe, in unmarked graves and neglected corners of royal crypts, lie the remains of princes and princesses whose only offence was being born different. Their names erased, their portraits destroyed, their existence denied. Yet they lived. They laughed, cried, and breathed fully human, despite every effort to pretend otherwise. And in their silence, they speak volumes about what happens when lineage is valued more than life itself, when appearance outweighs truth, when the fear of imperfection grows more monstrous than any imagined flaw. You are still in that tower room, centuries folding into one moment of abandonment. But now you know, you are not alone. Across eras and continents, in palaces, convents, and institutions, others share your fate. History may forget your name, but you were here. You mattered. And in that morning light, filtering through stone and centuries, that is enough. It must be enough, because it is all that remains when power chooses shame over love, absence over presence, forgetting over the far harder work of remembering.